My dear seekers of truth, I speak to you today from the depths of a lifetime spent excavating the hidden chambers of the human psyche, and I must share with you a revelation that has emerged from decades of listening to the secret confessions of souls in torment. You have come to this moment of spiritual seeking, not by accident, but because somewhere deep within your unconscious mind, a primal wound cries out for healing. This wound, which I have observed in every patient who has ever sat across from me, is the fundamental terror of being unloved, unworthy, and ultimately alone in an indifferent universe. You may believe your spiritual journey is about enlightenment, about connection to the divine, about transcending the ego, but I must tell you with the authority of one who has spent his life mapping the dark territories of the human soul, that beneath all these noble aspirations lies a single desperate cry that echoes from the earliest moments of your existence. That cry is simple yet profound in its implications for everything you will ever attempt to achieve in your spiritual life. It is the cry of a child who learned too early that love comes with conditions, that acceptance must be earned, that your authentic self is somehow insufficient for the love you crave. This early programming, buried now beneath layers of spiritual concepts and practices, continues to sabotage every attempt you make at genuine connection with the divine, with others, and most critically, with yourself. The tragedy I witness daily in my practice is the spectacle of souls who have dedicated years, sometimes decades, to spiritual practices while remaining fundamentally disconnected from the very love they seek. They meditate for hours yet feel empty inside. They study ancient texts yet remain strangers to themselves. They attend workshops and retreats yet return home to the same patterns of isolation and emotional numbness that drove them to seek spiritual solutions in the first place. What these earnest seekers do not understand, what their spiritual teachers often fail to recognize, is that their inability to receive love, to believe themselves worthy of love, creates an unconscious barrier that no amount of spiritual technique can penetrate. The psyche, you see, operates according to laws as precise as those governing the physical world, and until we understand these laws, until we bring consciousness to the unconscious patterns that govern our capacity for love, our spiritual efforts remain trapped in what I call the neurosis of seeking. I want you to imagine for a moment the sensation of reaching towards something you desperately want, but finding your hand stops just short of grasping it. Feel the frustration, the confusion, the growing despair as you realize that something invisible is preventing you from taking hold of what your soul most craves. This is the exact experience of millions of spiritual seekers who have unconsciously programmed themselves to reject the very love they claim to seek. Their unconscious mind, shaped by early experiences of conditional love, abandonment or emotional neglect, has created what I term love phobia, a systematic resistance to receiving the unconditional acceptance that is the foundation of all genuine spiritual experience. They pray for divine love while unconsciously pushing it away. They seek spiritual community while maintaining emotional walls that prevent true intimacy. They long for inner peace while harboring unconscious beliefs that they are fundamentally unworthy of such peace. The revelation I offer you today will challenge everything you have been taught about spiritual growth, but it comes from my direct observation of the human psyche in its most vulnerable and honest moments. The key to spiritual breakthrough is not found in ascending beyond your human needs, but in descending courageously into the depths of your most fundamental need for love and acceptance. This descent requires a kind of psychological archaeology, a willingness to excavate the buried experiences that formed your earliest concepts of love, worthiness and safety. Only by bringing consciousness to these unconscious patterns can you begin to heal the split between your spiritual aspirations and your human heart. Before we journey deeper into this exploration, I must ask you to pause and reflect honestly on your own experience. Have you found yourself repeatedly attracted to spiritual teachings that emphasize detachment, transcendence, or the illusion of human needs? Do you pride yourself on your independence, your ability to need nothing from others? If so, I invite you to consider that what you call spiritual detachment may actually be a sophisticated defense mechanism against the terror of being truly seen, truly known, and potentially rejected. Now we begin to examine the psychological architecture of love denial, a structure built in the earliest years of life when the developing psyche first encounters the complex dynamics of family love. The infant enters the world in a state of complete vulnerability and total dependence, requiring not just physical care but emotional attunement, consistent responsiveness, and what I call unconditional positive regard for their authentic expression. When these needs are met consistently, the child develops what psychologists now call secure attachment, a fundamental trust in their worthiness of love, and their ability to maintain connection even through conflict or separation. However, when these needs are inconsistently met, when love becomes conditional upon performance, compliance, or the suppression of authentic expression, the child's psyche adapts by creating what I call love survival strategies. These strategies, brilliant adaptations to difficult circumstances, become the unconscious blueprints for all future relationships, including the relationship with the divine. The child who learned that love comes only when they are good develops a perfectionist spirituality, constantly striving to be worthy of divine love. The child who experienced emotional abandonment when expressing vulnerability develops a spirituality focused on transcending human needs and emotions. The child who received attention only through crisis or drama unconsciously recreates spiritual emergencies and dramatic breakthroughs to feel worthy of divine attention. Each of these patterns, while adaptive in childhood, becomes a prison in adult spiritual life, preventing the very connection and love the soul most craves. What makes this phenomenon particularly insidious is that these unconscious patterns operate below the threshold of awareness, disguised as spiritual virtues or noble aspirations. The person who cannot receive love convinces themselves they are practicing non-attachment. The individual who fears intimacy believes they are cultivating spiritual independence. Those who have never learned to trust convince themselves they are wisely discerning. These psychological defense mechanisms, dressed in spiritual clothing, can sustain themselves for decades while preventing any genuine spiritual breakthrough. Let me share with you a pattern I have observed countless times in my work with individuals who present themselves as advanced spiritual practitioners. They speak eloquently of divine love, universal connection, and transcendent states of consciousness, yet their personal relationships remain shallow, conflicted, or non-existent. They can discourse for hours on the nature of compassion while remaining strangely disconnected from their own emotional pain and the pain of those closest to them. When questioned about this disconnection between their spiritual insights and their capacity for human love, they often respond with sophisticated explanations about the need to transcend attachment, the illusion of personal relationships, or the higher calling of impersonal love. What they do not recognize, what their unconscious mind desperately wants to avoid recognizing, is that their spiritual concepts have become a fortress protecting them from the vulnerability required for genuine love. They have created what I call a spiritual false self, a carefully constructed identity based on spiritual achievement and understanding, rather than authentic connection and emotional truth. This false self can maintain the illusion of spiritual progress while keeping the true self, with its deep longing for love and acceptance, safely hidden behind walls of concept and technique. The transformation I am describing requires what I call radical emotional honesty, a willingness to acknowledge the split between your spiritual ideals and your human experience. This acknowledgement is not a failure of spiritual development, but the beginning of authentic spiritual growth. When you can admit that despite years of practice you still feel fundamentally alone, still hunger for recognition and acceptance, still fear rejection and abandonment, you take the first step toward healing the artificial divide between spirit and psyche. In my therapeutic work, I have developed what I call the archaeology of love wounds, a systematic exploration of the unconscious patterns that prevent individuals from receiving and maintaining loving connection. This process begins with what I term conscious regression, a deliberate return to the emotional landscape of early childhood to identify the specific moments when love became conditional, dangerous, or unavailable. These moments, often forgotten by the conscious mind, but preserved in perfect detail by the unconscious, continue to influence every attempt at spiritual and emotional connection. I want to pause here and create a moment of deeper connection between us, because what I am about to share may stir emotions you have spent years learning to suppress. How many of you listening to these words have felt truly heard, not just intellectually understood, but emotionally witnessed, in your spiritual community? How often do you find yourself nodding along with spiritual teachings while feeling a quiet desperation that no one really sees the struggle beneath your composed exterior? If these questions touch something raw in you, I want you to know that this pain is not a sign of spiritual failure, but evidence of your authentic humanity crying out for recognition. I invite you to share in the comments below one moment when you felt truly seen and accepted, exactly as you are, not for your spiritual insights or achievements, but simply for your honest human experience. You might write something like, "The moment I felt most loved was when," or "I still long to be accepted for." Your willingness to be vulnerable in this way serves two profound purposes. First, it begins to heal the split between your spiritual persona and your authentic self. Second, it creates the possibility of genuine community with others who understand this struggle from the inside. The very act of naming your longing for love, of admitting your humanity in a spiritual context, begins to dissolve the unconscious barriers that have kept love at bay. Notice how even considering such vulnerability may trigger resistance, a voice that warns you against appearing needy, unspiritual, or weak. This voice is not your spiritual wisdom speaking, but your love survival strategy, protecting you from the risk of rejection. By acknowledging this voice without being controlled by it, you begin to reclaim your power to choose connection over protection, authenticity over image, love over fear. Now let us continue our exploration by examining the specific manifestations of love denial that I have observed in spiritual communities. The first pattern I call the helper syndrome, where individuals compulsively focus on giving love, support, and guidance to others while remaining unable to receive care for themselves. These helpers often enter spiritual communities as teachers, healers, or guides, unconsciously seeking love through service while maintaining the illusion that they need nothing from others. Their spirituality becomes a sophisticated form of what psychologists call codependence, where their sense of worth depends entirely on being needed by others. The helper believes they are practicing selfless love, but careful analysis reveals an unconscious contract. I will give you everything you need so you will love me, but I will never burden you with my own needs so you cannot reject me. This pattern often originates in childhood families where the child learned that love came only through taking care of others' emotions, becoming what I call the family emotional manager. These children grow into adults who can feel spiritual connection only through the role of giver, while any attempt to receive care triggers unconscious fears of being seen as weak, needy, or burdensome. The second pattern I observe is what I term enlightened isolation, where individuals pursue spiritual practices that emphasize solitude, self-sufficiency, and transcendence of human relationships. While these practices can certainly support genuine spiritual development, they often serve as sophisticated avoidance of the vulnerability required for love. The isolated seeker convinces themselves that they have transcended the need for human connection, while unconsciously protecting themselves from the risk of rejection, abandonment, or engulfment that they experienced in earlier relationships. This pattern frequently develops in individuals whose early family environment was chaotic, intrusive, or emotionally overwhelming. As children, they learn to find peace and safety only in solitude, developing what appears to be spiritual independence, but is actually a trauma response to overwhelming interpersonal demands. Their adult spirituality becomes an extension of this childhood survival strategy, maintaining the illusion of spiritual advancement while avoiding the healing that comes only through safe, consistent, loving relationships. The third pattern, perhaps the most subtle and therefore most dangerous, is what I call spiritual perfectionism, where individuals unconsciously believe they must achieve certain spiritual states or insights before they become worthy of divine or human love. These seekers approach spirituality like an examination they must pass, constantly measuring their progress, comparing themselves to others, and postponing self-acceptance until they reach some imagined level of spiritual development. Their spiritual practice becomes a form of what I call earned worthiness, where love remains always just beyond their current level of achievement. This pattern often develops in families where love was explicitly conditional upon performance, achievement, or compliance with specific standards. The child learns that their authentic self is unacceptable and begins the exhausting work of trying to become someone worthy of love. In adulthood, this translates into spiritual practices focused on self-improvement rather than self-acceptance, on becoming someone lovable rather than discovering they are already loved. Each of these patterns, while appearing to support spiritual growth, actually prevents the fundamental experience that makes authentic spirituality possible, the direct felt experience of unconditional love and acceptance. Without this foundation, spiritual practices become elaborate defenses against the very connection they purport to cultivate. Meditation becomes a way to avoid feeling rather than to feel more deeply. Prayer becomes a performance for divine approval rather than intimate conversation. Service becomes a strategy for earning love rather than expressing love freely given. The healing of these patterns requires what I call therapeutic spirituality, an integration of psychological insight with spiritual practice that addresses both the unconscious wounds that block love and the spiritual longing that drives the search for meaning. This integration recognizes that spiritual development and psychological healing are not separate processes but different aspects of the same fundamental transformation. The movement from fear to love, from isolation to connection, from defending against life to embracing life fully. The therapeutic approach I have developed works with what I call the love wound trifecta, the unconscious beliefs about self-worth that developed in early relationships, the defensive patterns that protect against further wounding, and the spiritual projections that keep healing at a safe distance. By bringing consciousness to each of these layers, individuals can begin to dismantle the barriers that have kept love beyond their reach, while developing the capacity to recognize and receive the love that has always been available. The first therapeutic intervention involves what I call conscious feeling, a deliberate practice of turning attention toward the emotions that spiritual practices often encourage you to transcend or transform. Instead of using meditation to escape from loneliness, you learn to feel loneliness fully, to explore its texture and message without being overwhelmed by it. Instead of using prayer to avoid anger, you learn to express anger safely while discovering the hurt and longing that lies beneath it. This practice of conscious feeling gradually dissolves the split between spiritual aspiration and emotional truth, allowing you to bring your whole self into your relationship with the divine. The second intervention focuses on what I call relational repair, a systematic healing of the capacity for intimate connection that trauma and early wounding may have damaged. This process often begins in therapeutic relationships where you can safely experience being known, accepted, and cared for without having to perform, achieve, or suppress parts of yourself. Through these corrective emotional experiences, you gradually develop what psychologists call earned secure attachment, the ability to trust in your own worthiness and in others' capacity to love you consistently. This relational healing then extends into spiritual community, where you learn to practice authentic connection with others who share your spiritual values. Instead of maintaining the spiritual persona that keeps you safe but isolated, you begin to risk being seen in your imperfection, your struggle, your genuine humanity. These experiences of being loved not despite your flaws but including your flaws gradually convince the unconscious mind that love is possible, that you are worthy, that connection is safe. The third intervention involves what I call divine relationship repair, a conscious healing of your relationship with the sacred that addresses the ways early family dynamics may have distorted your capacity to trust, receive from, and feel loved by divine presence. Many individuals unconsciously relate to God, universe, or divine consciousness with the same defensive patterns they learned in their family of origin. They pray like children trying to earn approval from critical parents, meditate like employees trying to impress demanding bosses, or approach spiritual practice like students trying to avoid the punishment of an angry teacher. Divine relationship repair involves gradually learning to approach the sacred as a loving presence rather than a judging authority, to receive spiritual guidance as gift rather than earned reward, to rest in divine love rather than work for divine approval. This process often requires grieving the loss of the loving divine parent you needed but never experienced, while opening to receive the love that spiritual presence offers in the present moment. The evidence for this integrated approach continues to emerge from modern neuroscience and attachment research, which validates many of the insights I developed through clinical observation decades ago. Scientists now understand that the human brain literally develops in relationship, that our capacity for emotional regulation, stress management, and connection forms through early attachment experiences. They have discovered that trauma and early emotional deprivation create measurable changes in brain structure that affect our ability to feel safe in relationship and to trust in love throughout our lives. Even more remarkably, research shows that healing relationships and therapeutic intervention can actually change brain structure at any age, creating new neural pathways that support connection, trust, and emotional resilience. The plasticity of the human brain means that no matter how early or severe your love wounds may be, healing remains possible when you have the right support and understanding. Your unconscious mind, which has been protecting you from love to avoid pain, can learn new patterns that allow you to receive love safely. Modern research on meditation and spiritual practices has also revealed something crucial for our discussion. Contemplative practices are most transformative when undertaken by individuals who have developed basic emotional security and the capacity for healthy relationships. Spiritual practices build upon the foundation of psychological health rather than replacing it. This means that addressing your love wounds and developing the capacity for intimate connection is not a distraction from spiritual development, but a prerequisite for authentic spiritual growth. The integration I am describing does not diminish the importance of traditional spiritual practices, but places them in a broader context of healing and growth. Meditation becomes more powerful when you no longer use it to escape from difficult emotions, but to develop greater capacity to feel and respond wisely. Prayer deepens when you approach the divine from authentic need, rather than spiritual performance. Service becomes more effective when it flows from fullness rather than emptiness, from love received rather than love sought. As we near the completion of our exploration, I want to offer you a vision of what becomes possible when you heal the split between your spiritual longing and your human need for love. Imagine approaching your spiritual practice not as a way to transcend your humanity, but as a way to embrace your humanity more fully. Picture yourself in spiritual community, where you can be authentically yourself, where your struggles and imperfections are met with compassion rather than judgment, where your growth unfolds naturally rather than through forced effort. Envision a relationship with the divine that feels like coming home to unconditional love rather than approaching a cosmic examination board. Consider what your service to others might look like when it flows from genuine abundance rather than unconscious neediness, when you help others because you want to, rather than because you need to be needed. Contemplate the peace that comes not from having transcended all human desires, but from having learned to desire wisely, to love freely, to receive gracefully. This transformation does not happen overnight, nor does it require you to abandon everything you have learned on your spiritual path. Instead, it invites you to bring greater consciousness and integration to your journey, to include your psychological healing as part of your spiritual development, to honor both your divine nature and your human needs as essential aspects of who you are. The path I am describing requires courage, patience, and usually support from others who understand both the spiritual journey and the process of psychological healing. It asks you to risk vulnerability in service of authenticity, to choose connection over protection, to believe that love is possible, even when your experience has taught you otherwise. This is not easy work, but I can tell you from my years of witnessing human transformation that it is the most important work you will ever do. My dear friends who have accompanied me on this exploration, I want to acknowledge the courage it takes simply to consider that your spiritual seeking might be intimately connected to your deepest human longings. This recognition requires a kind of spiritual humility that our culture does not often encourage, and willingness to admit that despite all your growth and insight, you still need love, still hunger for acceptance, still long to be truly seen and cherished for exactly who you are. If what I have shared today resonates with the truth you have perhaps been afraid to acknowledge, I want you to know that this channel exists as more than just a source of information. This is a community of souls who are committed to the integration of spiritual growth with psychological healing, who understand that authentic spirituality includes rather than transcends our humanity. When you subscribe to this channel, you join thousands of others who are on this same journey of healing the false divide between spirit and psyche, between divine love and human love, between who you are and who you think you need to become. Each week I share insights from my continued exploration of the unconscious patterns that either support or sabotage spiritual development. I offer practical exercises for healing love wounds, techniques for developing authentic relationship with the divine, and guidance for creating the kind of spiritual community that supports your whole self, rather than just your spiritual persona. Most importantly, I provide a consistent reminder that your spiritual journey is not about becoming someone worthy of love, but about discovering that you have always been worthy, that love has always been available, that the only thing standing between you and the connection you crave is the walls your psyche built to protect you from a pain that no longer threatens you. I ask you to subscribe, not just to receive content, but to make a commitment to your own healing and growth. I invite you to give this video a like, if it has touched something true in your experience, because your engagement helps ensure that others who are struggling with this same split between spiritual longing and human need can find their way to this message. Your simple action of liking and subscribing becomes an act of service to those who are still suffering in isolation, still believing they must choose between spiritual development and authentic relationship, still convinced that their need for love is a spiritual weakness rather than a fundamental aspect of their divine nature. The journey I am describing unfolds gradually, with patience and gentleness toward yourself, as you discover layers of protection and wounding you may not have known existed. But I promise you this, as you begin to heal the barriers that have kept love at bay, as you learn to receive the care and acceptance your soul has always craved, your spiritual life will transform in ways you cannot now imagine. You will discover that the love you have been seeking in peak experiences and transcendent states has been waiting for you in the simple willingness to be authentically, vulnerably, courageously human. This is the message I leave with you today. Your spiritual path does not require you to rise above your need for love, but to dive deeply into that need with consciousness, courage and compassion. In that diving, you will find not weakness but strength, not spiritual failure but the doorway to authentic spiritual fulfillment. The very thing you have been taught to transcend may be the key to the transformation you seek.